In 2021, workers were repairing an old room at Arlington House in Virginia. The room looked ordinary. Old brick floor, old walls, a fireplace. Nothing about it suggested that someone had deliberately hidden something beneath their feet nearly 2 centuries earlier. Then, while removing the modern floor and clearing away the sand beneath it, workers dug slightly deeper than expected, and they found 4 glass bottles. They were not scattered randomly. They were clustered together beneath the floor. One of them contained an animal bone. Archaeologists immediately stopped the work, because the bottles were sitting inside a small pit near the fireplace hearth. And the more closely researchers examined the arrangement, the less it looked like forgotten household storage. It looked intentional, possibly ritual, possibly a shrine. And most remarkably, archaeologists believe it may have been created by an enslaved family who lived in that very room. Their names were Selena and Thornton Gray, and what they left beneath their floor may tell us something deeply personal about how enslaved people preserved identity, protection, spirituality, and hope inside a system designed to take those things away. To understand why 4 old bottles could matter this much, we have to go back to the room itself. Arlington House was built between 1802 and 1818 on what became the Arlington Estate. The main house belonged to George Washington Parke Custis, and later to his daughter and her husband, Robert E. Lee. But the people who lived there were not all living in a mansion. Behind the grand architecture were smaller dependencies where enslaved people lived and worked. One of those spaces was the West Room of the South Dependency. It measured only about 16 by 18 feet. That was the home of Selena and Thornton Gray and their family during the middle decades of the 19th century. It was not simply a workplace. It was their living space, their bedroom, their family space, and eventually their hidden ritual space. Archaeologists had already recovered evidence of everyday life there. Buttons, fragments of ceramic dishes, animal bones, and even part of a porcelain doll. Those objects are easy to imagine. Broken plate, a piece of clothing, something a child once played with. Small traces of ordinary life. But ordinary life was exactly what made the discovery beneath the floor so important. Because the pit contained something different, something placed together, something apparently hidden, and something that may have carried meaning far beyond its physical value. The workers had removed a 20th century reconstructed brick floor. Beneath it was sand and modern fill. As they cleared the material, the 4 bottles appeared in historic soil. Archaeologists then investigated the area more carefully. They discovered that the bottles were inside a deliberately cut subfloor pit near the fireplace. The arrangement mattered. One report notes that the bottles were positioned side by side and pointed northward. One contained an animal bone. That combination was difficult to explain as ordinary storage, and suddenly a hole beneath a bedroom floor became something much more complicated. The question was no longer simply, what were these bottles used for? It became, why were they placed here? And perhaps even more importantly, who put them here? At first glance, a hidden pit might sound like a simple storage compartment. And archaeologists know that subfloor pits were common on some dwellings occupied by enslaved people. They could store food. They could hold personal possessions. They could conceal valuable objects. They could even have practical purposes that had nothing to do with religion. So archaeologists have to be careful. A bottle beneath a floor does not automatically mean shrine. Context is everything. But this particular context was unusual. The objects were not simply dumped into the hole. Their arrangement, completeness, location, and association with other artifacts suggested that they may have been deliberately assembled. And that is where the story moves from archaeology into something much more personal. Because archaeologists have found similar patterns elsewhere. At some African American archaeological sites in Virginia and the broader Chesapeake region, subfloor pits have contained objects whose arrangement has been interpreted as potentially spiritual. Complete bottles, tools, pipes, animal remains, objects that still had practical value when they were buried. That raised an uncomfortable question. Why would people who had limited access to possessions deliberately place useful objects underground? One explanation is that some of these objects were not being discarded at all. They were being offered. Across parts of West and Central Africa, spiritual traditions included relationships between the living and the dead. Ancestors could be understood as sources of guidance, protection, and spiritual connection. When Africans were forcibly transported to North America, they did not simply lose every tradition they had known. People carried memories, beliefs, symbols, practices, and they adapted them to radically different circumstances. That adaptation matters, because enslaved people lived under a system where nearly every part of their lives could be controlled by someone else. Their labor could be controlled. Their movement could be restricted. Their families could be threatened by sale and separation. Their possessions could be limited. Their bodies were controlled by law and violence. But there were still spaces where personal meaning could survive. Sometimes those spaces were extremely small. A corner of a room, an object kept close, or perhaps a hidden pit beneath the floor. Researchers studying subfloor pits have suggested that some could have functioned as private ancestor shrines or spiritual spaces. Not every pit did, but some contain combinations of artifacts that make a ritual interpretation plausible. And that brings us back to the Gray family's room, because there is an extraordinary detail. The archaeological evidence does not exist in isolation. Researchers also examine historical accounts from descendants of the Gray family. The Gray sisters later recalled where their parents' bed had stood inside the room. It was positioned near the fireplace, and that location was close to the very area where archaeologists found the pit. That means the shrine may have been hidden beneath or partially concealed by the family's bed. If that interpretation is correct, the location suddenly makes sense. It was private. It was difficult for outsiders to notice, and it was physically connected to the family's living space. Not somewhere public, not somewhere ornamental, not somewhere an overseer would immediately recognize. Beneath the floor, inside the home, close to the people who lived there. But there is another problem. What exactly was the shrine supposed to do? Archaeologists cannot simply look at 4 bottles and know what the people who buried them believed. The meaning of a ritual object depends on the people who created it, and that information was rarely written down. So researchers have used comparisons with African American spiritual traditions and archaeological discoveries from other sites. The bottles may have been what are sometimes called conjuring bottles. These could be associated with protective or magical practices. Some traditions understood such objects as ways of warding off harmful forces. Others connected them with spirits, protection, healing, or the manipulation of spiritual power. The National Park Service describes the Arlington assemblage as likely representing a spirit bundle and identifies the pit as a possible magical or religious shrine. But there is an important distinction. Possible does not mean certain. Archaeologists are not claiming that they can reconstruct exactly what Selena and Thornton Gray said, thought, or believed while creating the pit. There is no surviving note explaining the ritual, no inscription, no diary, no recorded ceremony. The evidence is physical, and physical evidence has limits. Still, the pattern is difficult to ignore. 4 bottles, a carefully positioned pit, an animal bone, a location beside the hearth, and a family whose descendants remembered the sleeping arrangement around the same area. Together, those details create a compelling interpretation. But then comes the bigger question. Why would someone need a hidden spiritual space inside their own home? The answer may be connected to the nature of slavery itself. For enslaved people, the home was one of the few spaces where family life could exist outside the direct structure of plantation labor. But even that space was not truly secure. The family could be separated. Their labor could be demanded. Their possessions could be taken. Their religious practices could be restricted or misunderstood. A hidden shrine could therefore represent more than religion. It could represent control. Not control over the plantation. Not control over the people who enslaved them. something smaller, something deeply personal. Control over a private space, a place where an individual or family could decide what an object meant, where something valuable could be hidden, where ancestors could be remembered, where protection could be sought, and where a spiritual tradition could survive without needing permission. That is one reason archaeologists describe these pits as potentially important expressions of identity. They may reveal not just what enslaved people owned, but how they understood themselves. There is another archaeological site that makes the Arlington discovery even more interesting. At the Arlington House site in North Carolina, researchers found another subfloor pit associated with an 18th century structure believed to have housed enslaved people. Inside were complete bottles, scissors, a pipe, axe heads, and other objects. And the objects were arranged in distinctive patterns. Some were crossed, others were grouped together. The arrangement was one reason researchers interpreted the feature as potentially connected to West African-derived spiritual practices. Again, it does not prove that every similar pit was a shrine, but it demonstrates that Arlington was not an isolated archaeological curiosity. There is a wider pattern. Objects hidden beneath the floors of African-American homes can sometimes preserve evidence of spiritual life that written history barely recorded. And that changes how we look at archaeology. For a long time, historical narratives tended to focus on buildings, owners, politicians, military leaders, large events. But archaeology can sometimes reveal something much quieter. What happened inside a room after the official history stopped talking? What did a family keep? What did they hide? What did they believe? What mattered enough to bury? Those questions can be answered through things that were never meant to survive. Bottle, a bone, button, a broken piece of ceramic, a small hole beneath the floor. The objects are ordinary. The arrangement is not. And sometimes that arrangement is the closest thing we have to a private message from people who left almost no written record. Map fades. There is also a fascinating uncertainty surrounding the date. Researchers cannot say with absolute precision when the Arlington pit was created. Stratigraphic evidence suggests it was dug sometime later during the historical occupation of the room, possibly after the 1840s. An 1868 Indian head 1-cent coin was found in upper layers associated with the bottles. That means the feature may still have been in use around that period, or at least that part of its upper fill dates to 1868 or later. The Gray family is known to have occupied the room before and through the Civil War, and the evidence makes them the most plausible creators of the shrine. But archaeologists deliberately use cautious language. Most plausible, not certain. That distinction matters, because the goal is not to turn a mystery into a perfect story. The goal is to reconstruct the most defensible story from the evidence that survived. And perhaps the most powerful part of this discovery is what happened to the objects afterward. They survived underground. The people who placed them there are gone. The room changed. The floor was rebuilt. The property became a historic site. Generations passed, and eventually, workers repairing the building unknowingly came within inches of something that had remained hidden for well over a century. Imagine that. Someone once knelt inside that room and placed those objects into the earth, then covered them, then walked across the floor. Perhaps the family knew exactly where they were. Perhaps only one or two people knew. Perhaps the ritual was repeated, or perhaps the objects were placed there once and left undisturbed. We cannot know. The evidence refuses to tell us everything, but it tells us enough. It tells us that beneath an ordinary floor, in a room occupied by an enslaved family, someone deliberately created a space that archaeologists now believe may have had religious or magical significance. And that small discovery changes the way we see the room. Because the floor was never just a floor. It was a boundary. Above it was the visible world of plantation life. Below was something private, something protected, something that belonged to the family. And that may be the real significance of the shrine. Not that it was mysterious, not that it was magical, but that it existed at all. In a world where enslaved people were repeatedly denied control over their own lives, someone found a way to create a hidden space that could belong to them. Under their feet, inside their home, out of sight, and perhaps for a little while beyond anyone else's control. The workers came looking at an old floor. They found 4 bottles. Archaeologists found a pit. Researchers found evidence of a possible shrine. But beneath all of that, they found something harder to measure. A trace of a family's inner life. The people who made it could not leave us a long written explanation. So they left objects, and they buried them where they mattered most. Years later, the floor was opened again, and for the first time in generations, that hidden space came back into the light. Maybe that is why this discovery feels so powerful. Because history is often remembered through the things powerful people chose to record. But sometimes, the smallest evidence tells another story. A story hidden beneath a floor. A story about family, memory, spirituality, and the quiet determination to preserve something of yourself when almost everything else could be taken away. And somewhere inside that old room at Arlington, beneath the floor where the Gray family once lived, 4 bottles survived long enough to tell us that story. Not everything they meant can ever be known, but the fact that someone chose to hide them there may be the message that survived most clearly. If you enjoy true archaeological discoveries that uncover the hidden lies behind history, subscribe for more.